Hey everyone! Today, we're diving into a really simple but honestly game-changing technique that the most effective teachers use. It's called begin with the end. It's all about making sure every single moment in the classroom is designed for one thing and one thing only: student mastery.
But let's start with a kind of tricky question. What if that super creative, really engaging, fun lesson that we all love to design isn't actually the best one? That's tough to think about, right? Because our intentions are always so good, but this question gets right to the heart of a really common teaching challenge.
And that challenge has a name. It's called the activity trap. You've probably been there. It's what happens when our planning gets wrapped up in what students are going to do, the cool project or the fun game, instead of what they ultimately need to know. And this can cause a huge disconnect, where a lesson is a blast, but it doesn't actually build the understanding we were aiming for.
So yeah, let's take a closer look at this activity trap. We're going to see why our best intentions can sometimes go off track and how easily, even the most experienced teachers can fall right into it.
Okay, so this slide just lays it out perfectly. On the left, you've got the traditional way. Find a cool activity, build your lesson around it, and then figure out how to assess it later. But look at the right. The begin with the end approach flips that whole thing on its head. You start with the objective, the goal. Then, and this is the key, you create the assessment second. And only then do you design the lesson that gets your students to that goal.
So the solution is this really simple but honestly profound shift in your thinking. Instead of planning forward from some activity, we plan backwards from a destination. It's a tiny change in the sequence of your planning, but it has this massive impact on how effective your teaching is. Which brings us to the how, planning in reverse. This part is the practical guide, the real how-to for getting out of the activity trap and starting to build lessons with a ton of purpose and precision.
A really great way to think about this is like using a GPS. You would never just get in your car and start driving, hoping you end up at the right place, right? No, you put in your destination first. Well, in teaching, that learning objective is the destination. The lesson just becomes the most direct, the most efficient route to get every student there.
So the whole process really just boils down to these 3 steps, and they have to be in this exact order. First up, the objective. You have to define with total clarity what you want your students to be able to do. Step 2, the exit ticket. You design the actual assessment that will prove they can do it. And only after you've done that do you get to step 3, the lesson, where you plan the activities that create the absolute shortest path for your students to crush that assessment. See, this forces a huge mental shift. The big question you ask yourself is no longer, hey, what's a fun thing for my students to do today? Instead, it becomes, what must my students practice over and over to demonstrate mastery on the assessment I've already made? That little change in how you frame the question, it makes all the difference.
And this brings us to the most important piece of the puzzle, the engine of rigor. We're about to focus on why that second step, designing the exit ticket, is really the key that unlocks a much more challenging and effective classroom. And the research on this is just undeniable. Study after study shows that formative assessment, and an exit ticket is a perfect example, is one of the most powerful tools we have for improving student learning. It consistently shows a really, really high impact.
But, and this is a big but, here's the catch, it's not enough to just have an assessment. The real power is in its quality. The cognitive demand of your exit ticket basically sets the bar for the entire lesson. If you have a simple assessment, you're going to have a simple lesson. A rigorous assessment, it forces you to teach a rigorous lesson.
Just look at this table. It makes the difference so clear. If your exit ticket is low rigor, something like define photosynthesis, well, your lesson only needs to cover basic memorization. But if your exit ticket is high rigor, demanding students analyze scenarios and justify their choices, well, now your lesson has to include practice with those deep analytical skills. The assessment literally becomes the engine driving everything. Okay, so what does all this actually feel like for the students? Because this isn't just some planning trick for teachers, it actually transforms the entire classroom culture. Let's look at the impact on students and how this whole approach builds a real culture of mastery. So the first huge benefit is something we can call radical transparency. Think about it. When students know the exact learning goal from the very beginning, and they can see exactly how they're going to have to prove they've learned it, their anxiety just drops, their performance goes up, there are no gotcha moments, no surprises, just a clear target to aim for.
And that kind of clarity leads directly to student ownership. When the finish line is crystal clear, students are suddenly empowered to track their own progress. They start to make choices about their own learning. They go from being these passive kids waiting for information to being active owners of their own success.
And when you put all that together, you foster a true culture of mastery. The whole focus of the classroom shifts away from just getting a grade to actually achieving a skill. It builds a growth mindset, that powerful belief that effort and persistence, guided by really clear feedback, are what actually lead to success.
All right, let's pull all these ideas together in our final section, Mastery by Design. This is all about taking these principles and using them to make sure that every single minute you have with your students is purposeful, effective, and really, really counts. It all comes back to what the source material calls the shortest path principle. Your objective is the destination. Your lesson is the most direct route to get there. This means every single activity, every single thing you do, has to directly serve that end goal. And we have to be willing to let go of activities that are, maybe clever or fun, but don't actually move students toward mastery in the most efficient way. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. It's a fair question. Isn't this just teaching to the test? It's a really common critique, and it's an important one to address. The answer, though, really depends on how we define the test.
And the comeback is a powerful one. Look, when the test is a rigorous tool that you designed, specifically to assess deep understanding, then teaching to it isn't a shortcut at all. It's just excellent, focused instruction. It ensures that you're teaching what truly, deeply matters.
So what's the big takeaway here? What's the blueprint? It starts by escaping that activity trap, by planning backward. Remember that the engine of your whole lesson is a rigorous exit ticket. Doing this creates transparency and empowers your students, and ultimately, it gives you a daily blueprint for instructional excellence.
And that really just leaves us with one last thing to think about as you get ready to plan your next class. Is your lesson designed as kind of a wandering journey, or is it a direct path to a very clearly defined destination?